Okay, good afternoon. My name's Carl Wiper. I work at the Information Commissioner's Office, and so we have the job of regulating all of this. I want to talk today about the concept of fairness in data protection, and specifically in relation to AI and automated decision making. And I want to talk briefly about some of the issues to do with explaining algorithms, and also look at, again briefly, the relationship between data protection and ethics in this space. And I want to end really by asking what sort of innovation we want out of this. Now, many of you will be familiar with these issues. Some of them have been very well aired in the discussion so far today, but it may be of interest perhaps to get the view from inside the regulator's office on some of these issues. So fairness as a concept is obviously fundamental to data protection legislation, almost in any jurisdiction, I would say. And the GDPR, as we know, talks about lawfulness, fairness and transparency as one of the key principles. So that really breaks down, I think, in two ways, principally. We'd see fairness as being, first of all, about reasonable expectations. Would people reasonably expect that you are using your data in the way that you have? And obviously that's particularly challenging in an era of big data and artificial intelligence. So I think if we're asking, would people reasonably expect, for example, that their social media posts were being used in order to calculate their insurance premiums, and not the content of their posts, but the language in which they express themselves in those posts, would people reasonably expect that to happen? Perhaps not. Now that's an example of something that was being developed, which didn't come to market in the end, but I think it shows the direction of travel here. Now clearly this is related to what people are told when the data is collected from them. And as you probably know, the GDPR has very specific provisions and a very specific list of information that you have to give to people when you're collecting data from them or acquiring it from third parties. And I think one of the challenging issues here is not just the what's on the list, but actually how it's technically possible to give that information when we're talking about data collected from Internet of Things devices through internet monitoring and so forth. And that's an area that we've looked at and have done some work around, looking at simple, practical, technical ways to provide that sort of information. So reasonable expectations informed by transparency at collection. But the other side of fairness is impact. The key question for us is the processing having an unjustified or harmful impact on the individuals concerned? And clearly that doesn't just mean a negative impact or an unwelcome impact. People, or some parts of the population, may resent monitoring for the purposes of anti-fraud, for example, or tax collection, but that doesn't mean that it's unfair, clearly. But we'd also say that even if the processing is fair to most of the people in the data set, if it's unfair to some of the people in the data set, then it's breaching the principle and it's still unfair. Okay. So, moving on to automated decision making, which has already formed quite a part of the discussion today. Again, as has been mentioned, there are specific provisions in the GDPR, of course, relating to automated decision making. I think it's not the intention of the GDPR, and it's not the approach of the regulators and data protection authorities such as ourselves to say that automated decision making and AI is a bad thing in itself. Clearly not. There are many situations in which we all welcome it. If we're hoping to purchase an item on credit in a store, how long do we want to wait for the credit decision to come through, for example? But obviously GDPR has to address the downside risk of doing this. I think it's important to just be aware of the way in which this issue is approached in the GDPR, because certainly in the run-up to the 25th of May, and certainly when we were helping to draft the European guidelines on this, this was the subject of considerable debate with both civil society and industry. Essentially, the structure of this famous Article 22 is that it's a prohibition. It says you can't do it, basically. And then there are exceptions to the prohibition, and there are safeguards around those exceptions. That's basically the structure. So the automated decision-making is, to begin with, defined fairly narrowly, I would say. As we heard just a few minutes ago, it's concerned with solely automated decisions with no effective human involvement. And certainly we would say that simply a token involvement of a human, just a rubber stamping, to use the phrase that was mentioned earlier, would not take it out of the definition. But we're talking here about solely automated decisions, which have a legal or a similarly significant effect. These are things like e-recruitment, where people may or may not be given jobs as a result, or credit scoring or credit decisions and so forth. The exceptions, as I'm sure you know, which permit it, are where it's being done for reasons of contract or consent, or it's authorised by law in the member state. So I think those exceptions themselves are quite widely drawn. So we have a fairly narrow prohibition and fairly wide exceptions to it. And clearly, where it is being done, rights and obligations go with it, particularly transparency. Again, so it's again, I think this is a key point. And there is specific information which has to be given to people about the way that the processing is being done and the automated decision making is being done. So that's an ex ante, to use the phrase that was mentioned previously, explanation of the processing. And people have rights to contest the decision, to express their point of view, and to obtain human intervention. The issue of a right to an explanation after the decision is made, an ex post explanation, was again mentioned, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But I think it's important to recognise as well the safeguards which are built into the legislation, which have to accompany any legitimate use of ADM, which are really to do with essentially designing out bias. They are safeguards against bias, appropriate mathematical, statistical procedures, etc. Very much the things which we are concerned with today. So, how does this relate to fairness and fairness in algorithms? I think a key question here is fairness to whom, if you like. So a system may have 90% accuracy, which in some circumstances will be considered an effective and useful system. But of course that may be because it's 100% accurate about 90% of the population, and it's completely inaccurate about 10% of the population. And of course what you tend to find is that it's always the same 10%. This 10% may be members of a particular socio-economic group or an ethnic group or whatever, but clearly there is that possibility. So there's clearly the potential for these systems to perpetuate bias which already exists in society and in systems. I think even though the processing itself is automated, clearly it's taking place within parameters which are determined by human beings, which are the results of value judgments and judgments about risk. So in the policing system that's used in County Durham, in the Heart system, for example, there are decisions there essentially about how many offenders you want to have on the streets, as opposed to how many you want to have going through the justice system and in prison. Now, some people would say the answer to that question is 0 on the streets. Well, if that's the value system, then you adjust the parameters accordingly. But there is a decision that's being made there. Similarly, in financial services, it comes down to a trade-off between risk and profitability. So the safest option, the avoidance of risk, is not necessarily the most profitable, clearly, if you're a lender. So there are decisions to be made about where you set those parameters, which are not entirely automated ones. We're also seeing advances in techniques to design out bias in systems. And there are a number of projects, a number of pieces of work which are being developed. Recently, I noticed Accenture, for example, announced a fairness tool that they developed. I haven't seen it, we haven't looked at it, I can't comment on it, but it's an example of recent developments. And Google as well, for that matter, are working in this area. So there are ways to, or there is work going on ways to address this. Okay. So, to return to this issue of explaining algorithms. Now, we know that there has been considerable debate in academic and legal circles about the extent of a right in the GDPR to an ex post explanation of algorithmic decisions. And there are many in the audience who I'm sure can give us a detailed account of that issue. But I don't really want to retread that this afternoon. But what I would point out is that from an organisation's point of view, from a data controller's point of view, they do have to give people a right to complain about the decision, to contest the decision, and they have to answer that and put a human into the loop. I think in practice, that process itself is very likely to involve some form of explanation. It might be difficult to do it without giving some form of explanation about how the system would work. And moreover, if the regulator ourselves were looking into that issue, then we would certainly want to know how the decision was reached, an explanation of the decision, in order to check for compliance. So a controller could be explaining the decision to two audiences, to the people concerned and to the regulator. Okay. But I think so the question is really, who explaining to whom? Who is the explanation for? And I think the audience obviously is going to affect the type of explanation and the way that it's done. Because in terms of explaining decisions to the people affected, there are various ways in which you can do this. People are often most concerned about the data. When you discuss this with people in contexts where you can have a detailed discussion, citizens, juries, and so on, people are most concerned about the data. They think that there was something in the input data which perhaps they weren't aware of, or that was inaccurate, which has affected the result. And that could be the case. That's one way to explain it. But there are other ways as well. For example, what was the weighting that was given to the different elements? What about the counterfactual explanation? If my income had been greater by X, would that have affected whether I got the loan or not? Another way to look at it is an approach based on equity. So, am I being treated the same as other people who are more or less the same as me in this situation? So there are a number of ways that you can try to explain this definition. That's something that we're exploring. The government, as you probably know, has asked us through the AI sector deal to look into this issue of explaining algorithms and to produce a framework for organisations on how to explain their algorithms. No small task, you might think. But this is one which we've taken on. We're working with our friends at the Alan Turing Institute on this. And work is underway on that. In the initial stages, we're particularly concerned to understand the public's views on this. So we're looking to methods such as citizens' juries, as I mentioned earlier, to explore this issue in more detail. And then we want to play those findings back to our stakeholders in business and in government to help inform our thinking on this. And more generally, we are, as a regulator, we are resourcing up to do this. We're expanding our technology function, we're expanding our staffing around these issues so that we're in a better position to examine these, to examine algorithms, to look at ways of explaining them in the same way that we've done in the past around cybersecurity. For example, we're developing our capability in that way. In the discussions that we have with organisations about this, one subject seems to come up quite a lot at the moment. I was at an event last week in London about the use of AI in the auto insurance sector. And there was a pretty clear message there from some of the business representatives that the more explainable you make the algorithm, the less accurate it is. Now, that's a view which is expressed, but I think that's something which bears examination and it bears probing. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at. I'd like to sort of move on to this issue of the relationship between data protection and ethics, because as we discuss these issues, I think we're inevitably we move away from the specific detail of what's in Article 22 and what's in the recital and so forth, to some of the more underlying issues, which essentially are ethical ones. And I think we've seen over the last few years a number of businesses and public sector bodies developing ethical approaches to the use of data. In business, an early example of this, I think, was AMIA, the company which handled Nexicard, for example, which developed a set of ethical principles which we mentioned in our report on big data, AI and machine learning. And since then we've seen, obviously, many other companies doing this. Now, I think it would be simplistic to say this is simply publicity, this is simply a fig leaf which they're putting up in order to mask their darker purpose. That's one way of looking at it, but I think it would be too simplistic and I think overly cynical. I think it would be more reasonable, I think, to say that they see it as a means of differentiation, as a potential means of competitive advantage, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the ethical framework has no value. We're also seeing the development in government as well, of course, with the second edition, if you like, of the government's ethical framework for the use of data. And there's a lot happening in the health sector as well in various parts to develop these principles, based and developed from, in some ways, research principles and research ethics. And I think what's interesting here is that you're seeing a spectrum of ideas. So some organisations are looking at having ethics boards and a formal structure like that. But in other cases, it's about a simple sort of litmus test which employees can use when they're considering new uses of data. What's rather pejoratively referred to often as the granny test, or more grandly, the sunshine test, I think. But essentially a rule of thumb that can be applied. Now, a key development in this area is the creation of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And we have followed that with interest. We've given our comments in the consultation on that. We look forward to working very closely with the CDEI going forward. I think one of the interesting ideas as well that's developing here is the idea of society in the loop, if you like. Now, we've talked about humans in the loop, but I think there's some discussion now about society in the loop. I think that really that points to the need to build awareness of these issues amongst civil society groups, and to look at ways to give civil society a voice in these issues, so that it takes it away from the issue issue of simply the individual versus the organisation, with the regulator intervening when called for. I think there's a role for the voice of civil society in this. And I think as a regulator, obviously our primary concern is data protection. That's the job that we're given to do, to regulate the use of data protection. But data protection itself is based on rights, and so inevitably it raises ethical issues. But I think there are ethical issues in this space which are not essentially or inherently data protection issues. And that's what is making life interesting for us at the moment, I would say. So, for example, if you anonymise your data, and of course that's a whole other discussion, but let's assume that you can anonymise your data set completely. Now that takes it out of data protection. So we're not interested in that anymore, really, in simple terms. But obviously you can use anonymized data in ways that have profound and perhaps harmful effects on individuals, which essentially is more of an ethical question. Or if you take an example in the insurance sector, say there's a move at the moment, of course, because of the use of AI, to the micro-segmentation of risk. Now, obviously there are advantages to that from a business point of view, but essentially it's getting away from the idea of pooled risk, which traditionally was what the insurance business was based on. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing, really? From society's point of view, is that a good trend or not? Again, that's to do with the use of data in that case, but it raises these wider ethical issues. But it's something that data protection authorities are increasingly getting involved in. As you may know, we have, at the end of this month, the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners. Bodies like ourselves from our opposite numbers from all over the world getting together, and the issues they're discussing, top of the agenda, is artificial intelligence and ethics. So DPAs are really in this space. Okay, finally, we've heard mention earlier about the privacy paradox on this, and this is still something that we find when we're speaking at meetings and talking to groups. There's still this view that people say they're interested in privacy, but they're not really. Their practice shows that they're not really. And our point on this is always that this is too simplistic a view, that the reality is much more nuanced than this. We heard earlier about the approach of young people to these issues, and I think this is an area where people's views are more nuanced than is often credited for. Our own annual survey recently published showed that the percentage of people who really trust organisations, business and government, with their personal data was actually increasing. Sort of compared to last year, there was actually an increase, but it was still only at about a third, so it's still only a minority of the population. Now there are, let's not forget, enormous potential benefits to be gained from innovation in this space and from the increased use of AI and algorithmic decision making. Benefits for society and benefits for all of us. But it depends on building trust, on taking people with you. And really that's our message to organisations, that they need to use the tools which are in the GDPR, for example, data protection by design, which goes to some of the points I was making earlier, data protection impact assessments, which again is a way of making this sort of essentially ethical analysis. They need to do this in order to build trust with their citizens, with their customers, and take them with them. Because we think that innovation with privacy is a possibility, and indeed it's essential. Thank you very much.
An issue arisen in some of our conversations recently about impact assessments and the ability, if you look at the learning of digital technologies, it's quite a supply chain things coming in. The mechanism how you can support someone to talk interact with the customers, for them to do data protection impact assessment. Then essentially you have substantial amount of information about the component technologies they're using. They're just putting it down and thought about ways in which suppliers of technology which a priori could use personal data or not, and to apply to algorithms. How they could go about documenting in a way that explains to people, this isn't already explaining to consumers, but explaining to the people trying to impact assessment. What the implications of these technologies are. Focus more on that sort of the supply chain problem of how do we get the top end of the chain to do data.
Yeah, sure. I think it raises the issue of due diligence, really. And there's there's been a lot of discussion about this. We've been doing some work recently looking at, or commissioned some research actually, looking at accountability frameworks and various models for accountability frameworks for personal data around the world. And one of the key themes that comes out of this is this due diligence in terms of where your data's coming from and where it goes to if you're sharing it or selling it or whatever. So it's a sort of responsibility for the data throughout the life cycle before you acquire it and after you passed it on. Which is an interesting idea, I think, and I think this has a bearing in this context, because I think it's in this case we're talking about the analytical capability, if you like, rather than the raw data itself. But I think there's a responsibility to have the same sort of approach, because this technology is being used for personal data. So I think it's a logical extension of that. On the one hand, you're checking the permissions, if you like, on the data that you've acquired, but similarly, you want to look at how what's happening in the black box that you've bought, if you like. And I think it's going to be incumbent on controllers to look at that and to take some responsibility for that.
Okay, so I think the real kicker is
Go on.
we've been trying to consider this in the context of which someone is trying to manage their IoT processing of the business data, and when are they and when are they not data controller. So it gets a bit complex. Thank you for the due diligence.
Okay. Happy? Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan Rossi, you talked a bit earlier about explaining
Yeah.
the importance of engaging the public and the citizen juries. Is there a need to step up this significant distance? Is there a need to go out to schools to ensure that the school curriculum actually includes issues around the responsible use of data? I'm struck by the extent to which the school curriculum fails to address issues such as that, data information and data issues. Do you have any thoughts about what can be done? I mean, not only by ICO, but working in partnership with others.
Yes, I think you make an important point, certainly. And I think Baroness Kidron's comments earlier on the importance of looking at the children's perspective on this were very welcome. Yes, the education in this does need to start so at an early age. And I mean, for our part, we made a modest contribution to this by producing a kit around data protection issues and data privacy issues specifically for the use in schools, which, if I may say so, was proved quite popular and was used. But that's simply one contribution to this. Others can take that ball and run with it and produce other materials, certainly. I think that is important. I think there's another dimension as well, if we're thinking about education, which is ensuring that data protection issues, privacy issues and ethical issues are part of the training of data scientists. That they need to be very much there in the curriculum at university level, at postgraduate level, I think, because we need to ensure that when those people who are trained in that way go out into work, that they don't see data protection and privacy as the job of the compliance department over there, but they see it as part of their job, as part of data governance and data management.
Two sort of interlinked questions about the due diligence role around, in particular, automated decision making.
Yeah.
Risky processing. So in the beginning of your slides, you mentioned that fairness is going to have to consider if systems are unfair for a small portion of those.
Yes.
And I was wondering on your thoughts about how that mixes with the significance requirement in those cases. Yet most firms consider them not to be significant. However, when we look at some organisation who is potentially delivering automated decisions to millions of people, and a small subset of those might be significant, to what extent should they be seeking a lawful ground for all of those decisions? And to what extent should they look forwards to say there may be some significant decisions that we don't know about that may occur within that? So that's the first part. And the second part, which is also linked to that, as you mentioned, Recital 71 and so on has issues around statistical debiasing discussed. But there is a challenge that myself and my colleague Ruben Binns have been working on, which is it's tricky to understand some of the discriminatory effects without collecting data that would trigger Article 9 and would require explicit consent largely. And so to what extent do firms need to take a more active role, potentially going out and collecting data that could be sensitive in order to understand the potentially discriminatory effects of that process?
Yeah. Okay. On your first point about advertising, which can have particular effects on a subset of the population, if you like. This was one of the most contentious things that we discussed when we were working on the guidelines, and there was a school of thought that marketing, if you like, direct marketing in that way, can never have a significant effect on people, and that view was expressed really quite strongly by the industry, obviously, and others. Right. Which, well, I say obviously, but in a way it's ironic because presumably the intention is that it should have some effect on people. So we get into an interesting space there, don't we? I think one view was that people always have a choice. You know, we can show them gambling advertisements all day long, but ultimately it's their choice as to whether they actually place the bet or not, which, you know, is a point of view. There was also the view that that we don't know as advertisers. Of all the people who are seeing our ads, who can deal with them in a perfectly responsible way, and it doesn't have an effect. How do we know which ones in that population will be adversely affected? So this is a problematic area, certainly. And I don't want to suggest that we've got a simple answer to this. Certainly the Article 29 Working Party didn't come up with a simple answer to it. But you know, there is something which could potentially go wrong here, isn't there? There is something which could, where the use of this technology, the use of which can clearly have a significant effect on some vulnerable individuals, vulnerable in a range of ways, and the legislation is pointing towards, you know, this being a bad thing and a means of redress for this. So I think it's something that we don't really have all the answers to at the moment. I mean, I think you make an interesting point, as a relevant point certainly, that it's difficult to even assess that without collecting special category data, sensitive personal data, as we used to call it. So it does get into a difficult area. We don't have a simple answer, but clearly there is a problem which the legislation is at least trying to address. I think that's probably as much as I can say on that for now.
I have one quick question.
Please.
The question is, what can the research community do to assist you in your work, if any? What's the most helpful contribution you make?
Sure. Well, there is research, but more would be always welcome around ways to explain what's going on in the black box, in simple terms. And that may be about developing methodologies that don't involve opening the black box, because there are ways to explain algorithms without trying to explain how the information, the data bounces around the neural network. There are ways of doing it, but I think that's an area where more research is always welcome. Certainly, more practical work. So that would certainly help. And I think more thinking about explainability and models of explainability. There's been some very useful articles on that recently, certainly. So, but more work on that would always help us. I mean, we're doing work ourselves, and we also commission research ourselves. As you know, we have a grants program on that, so we also commission research. But work around that is always helpful.
Thank you very much. And so, first